top psychologist in the world a couple years ago, and but that was the point of Dr. Cunningham on the stand, and I'll tell you, defeated the prosecutor's attempts.
It went remarkably well. When we came back from London, Department of Homeland Security, that's compliments of supporters that were there today. We were told there's a high-profile case going on. What's with the bomb-sniffing dogs? And I said conspiracy theories and possibly schizophrenia. Fast. It was pretty much rebutted, and the doctor did absolutely great. He said over and over, he painted a really great narrative. There was some concern originally that if supporters came, it would make it look like Schaefer. But what the psychologist said that was so, he said Schaefer has not changed his music. His music is the same, but his words have changed. So the words he was using 10 years ago, he's not using now. His overall beliefs and patterns are the same, but his music has not changed. However, the music that he plays is not a threat to anybody whatsoever, and had it not, the violence wouldn't have been introduced to start with. They did talk about the different groups that he was in and the different devices that he had, and it was discussed that these against anybody, and then also said, the prosecutor said, did you know Cox was in Liberty Bell, Second Amendment groups, sovereign citizen groups? They were all anti-government. And it was really great when the doctor, I'm sure you guys noticed that, and said, I'm aware he supported Second Amendment groups. Outside of that, I'm not sure the groups did anything outside of me. That doesn't necessarily mean they're anti-government, that their goal was to have the government uphold the Constitution. And just because you're kind of holding the government accountable doesn't make you anti-government. That might even make you pro-government. Otherwise, you would talk about abolishing your government altogether. But Schaefer was moving for accountability within government. He was trying to work in the legislative, writing laws to protect the Second Amendment. Clearly, that's not an anti-government individual.
One thing I noticed about some of this was the concentration on what some of the informants said and how they set Schaefer up. Mm-hmm. It looks like to me there was weeks of this. One witness mentioned that there was over 100 hours of recording informants,
yep.
And this was inventory stuff that the informants, like Will Coleman in this one, but Bill Fulton was one of these main informants that was there, has been there all day long today, sitting on the prosecution side, and he said some very inflammatory things, trying to putting words in Schaefer's mouth all along while he's recording it.
Mm-hmm. Right. One of the major ones is, the fact is they were trying to set him up on a conspiracy charge. So Mr. Fulton, the informant, had asked Schaefer Cox, "What's your plan? What's your plan? You need a plan." And even alluded to the fact that Schaefer could have his throat slit unless he had a plan. So here's the federal government basically forcing Schaefer Cox to come up with a plan so that they could convict him.
Mm-hmm. And this guy's being paid by the federal government. All I'm being paid.
It's painted a clear picture. The conspiracy apparently was between the federal informant. It wasn't even the defendants on their own. So if the violence was being pushed from an informant, you didn't have two people making plans. You had Schaefer and his guys making plans, prepping and whatnot. But the actual violent talk was between the defendant and the informant. So
to some extent. Now there were two co-defendants, one of whom I believe has been released from prison, and the other is Lonnie Vernon, who apparently is still in prison, and so there were some co-defendants, and one line of questioning where this prosecutor, in my opinion, totally failed to prove his point. He was getting this psychologist to answer questions about, well, did you know that Schaefer Cox started this organization? Did you know he started that organization? Did you know he was the head of this organization? And yet you say he's shy? And the Dr. Cunningham blew the guy away, the prosecutor, and he says, I've never once said he was shy. That's not at all my testimony. Right. Literally, that was the entire line of cross-examination, and it went flat for the government.
Another great statement was the prosecutor asked the doctor, are you aware that even up to October of 2019, Schaefer Cox has been receiving letters, or the judge has been receiving letters on behalf of Schaefer, alluding that Cox has been done wrong. Are you aware of that? And the doctor doesn't miss a beat. He says this whole sentencing is under the presumption that Cox has been at Court of Appeals. That means some is a conspiracy theorist because they believe months. And he responds 310 months sentence built on the fact that he's been targeting CMU. He's in CMU because of the conspiracy and the solicitation to murder. Flat out. Never say.
Back to some of those partial weapons or parts. Some of them weren't even weapons. They weren't even. They were just parts of things. The informants, they are the ones for Cox with these parts, these unworkable weapons, or what they want to call them, illegal
grenade shells, which weren't even usable as grenades, but Schaefer Cox was convicted of possession of grenades.
They tried to paint him as the sovereign citizen. It was that he met in Denny's with his friends, where they were to nullify findings regarding domestic violence and also the weapon charges. Prosecution was really upset about this coffee meeting at Denny's, and I loved how every time he tried to push, he's circumventing the courts and he's meeting, and he responded, "Yes, they met, but I'm not sure their nullifying of the charges accomplished anything more than the coffee they drank." Continues to go back to the First Amendment. These people met. You could sit around all day and say, "I do not have the speeding ticket that I just got right now. Will you find me not guilty of that? Did we just commit a crime? Did we just, mock or flip our nose up to the courts? And if we did, is that illegal?" It was literally a bunch of guys getting together at, having coffee and making up their own little court that accomplished nothing in the end. They never tried to use force to get the courts to override the decision. They never said, we did this, now we're gonna hurt somebody if the court take this off the docket.
They moved to another witness, Mr. Michael Anderson. Now I understand he was a co-defendant, but he also may have been testifying on behalf of the prosecution. That's my understanding.
Yes, he was a witness.
He said, actually, one of the few cases where I think paragraphs from the Gulag Archipelago by Alexander, Soviet communism, and Solzhenitsyn had paragraphs in the book about if and Mr. Anderson both had referenced the
just wrapping up with the doctor, Strachey, is it Strachey? Is that how you pronounce it?
Mr. Rocky or something.
Strachey. Yeah. The doctor, he was very upset or tried to be on the fact that Schaefer Cox wasn't just doing things in his own group having coffee, but he was actually trying to move into legislation and change things, which again is so ironic that would be a negative when that clearly shows he supports government. He just wants it to be on track. But he brought up the fact that Schaefer came in on a three-way tie, getting almost 35% of the vote running for office, and just that was. And the prosecutor said, "You would believe anything Schaefer Cox told you. Is that correct?" And the doctor leans forward and says, "No, sir, he is a most unreliable source."
Yeah, the doctor did not.
He was not biased
at
at
several
all.
times he did not help Schaefer at all. He called him childlike in some of his fantasies about building a submarine, a militia submarine.
Being taken in by Russia.
He referred to
as a
Schaefer Cox
refugee.
as childlike in some of his ideas.
But the interesting thing that I thought in this whole case is they try to paint him in the original charges as being the one seeking violence. And throughout this, it really paints this picture that Schaefer actually wanted to protect his family. And so because of his ego, he wouldn't have been the one to go out and seek violence. And so the very idea that he was trying to, conspire to murder federal officials went against the very nature of who his ego is. His ego is puffed up on, I'm the hero, I'm going to save the day, I'm the good guy, and I'm going to protect my family and my neighbors, and call me with the Liberty Bell, I'm going to show up and help you. And so this idea that he would want to hurt somebody is actually completely counterproductive to his belief of what a great person he is, and the only way violence would have been used if somebody was being harmed, and even at that it was proven false, because when they were essentially coming after him, he was trying to flee to Canada.
He was
So
pretty much
once
been called-
again, there's no violence
He
there.
was considered a prepper. What if something
Yep.
happened? What if the government failed? And so it was all these big things that could happen that probably would never happen, is what they would even say.
Yep.
Schaefer believed if the government fell, this is what we're preparing for. He was putting.
And they say you could, go 3 days and you're out of food. So, prepping and being prepared and thinking through things was a pretty big deal for people in his community. It's not being tried. It wasn't in his community because they all stipulated on both sides that this would be held in Washington, for those of you wondering why it wasn't up there in Fairbanks. But Washington is very different. Prepping and doing a lot of the things he was not out of the ordinary at all for him. We go into the list, and it's definitely help to Schaefer for being released, but he focused in on his marriage, and he said, you referred to the marriage as estranged. Is it intact? What is it? I know when they're talking about release, people are more likely to be released if they're going back.
They've separated him
They've
for the last
separated
8 years.
Yeah.
Total.
Anyway, the answer was they're legally married. They're not continuing in a relationship and moving on at the
The
DC.
final witness first, the defense team, Mosa, who was an investigator trying to track down a couple things. Number one, this idea of the 2-for-1, which has been to murder 2 government agents for every one. In the discovery dated February 12, 2011, the first time that idea, the 2-for-1 concept appears, and then last time of Schaefer's world of discourse. Nonetheless, it is another episode that involved him going to a radio station with a couple of security people who had been under the understanding that they were being watched and subject to a imminent attack by a 6-man federal assassination team. And there had been an agreement that if that happens, they would,
do a 2-for-1 or something. It was
something
thrown
like
out.
that.
But that was also came up with after the informants kept pushing Schaefer. What is your plan? So he throws out, over a couple-day period. I don't know, 2-for-1. If they come for any of us, and this team comes, then we'll do this 2-for-1 deal. But I loved how his defense, who I think is just
Of Mr. Vernon, Lonnie Vernon, rather Schaefer